Hello and welcome to our CJS seminar series here at the University of East Anglia in Norwich. I'm absolutely delighted to be here today as host to welcome our guest from Hungary, András Bartók. So I'm Ra Mason, Sasakawa Lecturer of International Relations and Japanese Foreign Policy here at the university, and this is part of our ongoing seminar series. And just a quick reminder that for all of you who have comments and queries and questions, please do pop those in the Q&A if you're joining us by Zoom. Obviously, if you're here in person, you can raise your hand. But I know a lot of us today, it's part of Reading Week. You know, people are here and there and everywhere, but joining us online. So please do use the Q&A feature, and we can then feed your questions to András at the end of the talk. So to introduce our speaker, he is assistant lecturer at the University of Public Service, who in the Faculty of Public Governance and International Studies. And he is currently in the process of completing his PhD there. So, you know, a very talented young speaker we have with us. He has a BA in East Asian Studies and an MA in Japanese Studies from Karoli University. And he's also a Sasakawa Young Leaders Fellow. So very esteemed achievements, working mostly in the areas of international security, strategic studies, and also maritime military studies. So without further ado, I'm delighted to hand over to András. András.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, and thank you, everyone, for joining the lecture. And I'd like to thank the University of East Anglia for the invitation. I'm just gonna make sure if the slides are working. So if I press here, okay, we're moving with the slides. Yes, I'm gonna jump over a couple of slides because they're just here for me as a clutch. But as a brief introduction, my research area covers East Asian security studies. So I'm doing my PhD dissertation at our university's Faculty of Military Studies and Officer Training, but I'm a civilian. And I usually have to have the standard disclaimer that whatever I say as research findings are in no way affiliated with the military, the university, the Hungarian government, or anyone for that matter. These are just my research findings. And basically what I was thinking about talking today is mainly my dissertation's topic, which I have actually just finished the manuscript last week, so it's still fresh, and the trauma is still fresh. So this is my way of working through it. But basically, I was trying to conduct a research focusing on the Senkaku Diaoyu Island issue. Coming from a background of East Asian studies and Japanese studies, just Japanese and Chinese relations in general were of interest to me. And at the time when I was looking for a PhD topic, this was one of the main issues within the Sino-Japanese relationship. So I joined the Doctoral School of Military Studies, and I kind of liked it. So I moved a bit away from general diplomatic relations and diplomatic theory, and more into the realms of military security and security studies. So what I would like to present to you is an analysis regarding the Senkaku Island issue, which I would argue is a very important piece of the puzzle of the regional security complex of East Asia. And it's an interesting part of the puzzle because it's an intensive hybrid confrontation between the two claimants, but it has not escalated to the level of military conflict. So my main driving question was, why? We could say that there were close calls. So in 2012, 13, and 14, there were instances when Chinese warships have used their weapons targeting radar and locked onto Japanese units in international waters. according to international law, this might be considered an act of military aggression. But my research topic is not within the realms of international law. So I'm going to start with the basic assumption that even incursions into Japanese airspace, which did happen a couple of times, do not constitute actual military escalation. So we start with the basic idea that there hasn't really been an escalation. And to find out why, I have come across a very convoluted research methodology called Bayesian Process Tracing, which I'm going to try to introduce in a bit. But basically, the starting point has to be coming up with explanations to a complex question where you're not necessarily going to be able to find exact empirical evidence. So unless we would be able to sit down with 4 consecutive Chinese premiers, Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and Xi Jinping, and ask them directly and get an honest answer, we would not necessarily be able to find out how and why it did not escalate. But just basic understanding of escalation would suggest that some form of military calculation had to be part of the whole picture why China has not chosen to escalate the Senkaku Island dispute. So that was my main train of thought. So I looked at the literature, and I could mainly put most of the explanations that tried to deal with escalation potential of the Senkaku Islands. I was able to kind of push them into 4 broader categories. The most commonly discussed one was the guarantee by the US. So US security guarantee has proved to be some sort of a controlling factor on Chinese actions regarding the Senkaku Islands. The second most often cited one is of economic interdependence. So both of these are not something that's based on Japanese agency, Japanese capabilities, Japanese military capabilities. There are some mainly Japanese and Chinese works that highlight how China should first take Taiwan and then move on to the Senkakus. There was a Japanese former general who sparked a wider dispute within the Japanese security studies circles of whether or not this is actually true. But this is one explanation. And finally, I think that the most under-researched and under-looked at explanation is Japan's own deterrent capabilities. So I came up with these 4 hypotheses, which I think all can show us some sort of answer to the question why hasn't the Senkakus escalated yet, and present different sides of these answers. But I wanted to know which one might be the strongest, and that's how I came up with this research. Came upon this research methodology approach called Bayesian Process Tracing. It's basically named after a British mathematician who worked with mathematical probabilities. And statistical mathematics uses an equation called Bayes' theorem. And since the 1990s, social sciences and political and international studies have sometimes used a Bayesian approach to try and answer complex, difficult questions where you're kind of forced to answer the question, like we should be interested in what's deterring China. But since it's happening within the subjective decision cycle of the Chinese political leadership, we will never be able to look inside their heads. So the closest we can come to the truth is some sort of probability. And Bayesian analysis does exactly that, tries to express probability in a way that you build up analysis, which you can update later. So it's an ideal technique if we have a situation where we have not the whole of the picture, and we can never have all of the information because one of the 4 premiers is already dead and the other 3 are not going to sit down with us and tell us the answer. So we will never be sure, but we still have to express some sort of educated guess. And basically what some researchers in the field of international relations point to is to use Bayesian analysis to kind of answer these sorts of questions. Most notably, Andrew Bennett and Tasha Fairfield are the 2 researchers who describe multiple approaches to how to build up a Bayesian analysis. But this is the central idea of it. We have multiple hypotheses, and we want to identify how strong one hypothesis might be compared to the others. So what is the ratio within the complete grouping of probability of one hypothesis and how this relates to other explanations? And what the methodology suggests us to use is to borrow Bayes' theorem from statistical mathematics and express that the closest we can get to the answer, so our posterior probability of the strength of one hypothesis, is going to be some form of combination of our prior knowledge, so the prior probability, and a deep and meticulous analysis of the problem through which we identify some key evidence. So some key facts, if we can get them, or some key analytic assessments that points towards either of the hypotheses or more of them. It doesn't have to be one, but does give us some sort of inference on which hypothesis is stronger. And basically what this equation says is that the ratio of one hypothesis to the others posterior, so at the end of our analysis, is going to equal the ratios of the prior with other prior hypotheses and the ratio that we come to at the end of our analysis, looking at the evidence we have gathered and the new inferences. So inferences are not necessarily statements or facts, but things that we come up onto during our analysis that make us reevaluate how we approach, how we weigh some evidence against others. So yes, this is the main mechanism of a Bayesian analysis. And in my dissertation, I used these 4 hypotheses of why China has not escalated the Senkaku Island disputes. And I argued that they are very closely related. So protocol would suggest to give them an equal share of probability, but some are more researched than others, and some have gathered more arguments to support them than others. So I did a little tweaking with their numbers and made the one that's most often argued the strongest, the other one the second strongest, and we have a ranking. And I conducted a case study of Chinese and Japanese defense policies, events related to the Senkaku Islands, and also have looked at different power metric methodologies, ways that we can try to measure and quantify power in the international sphere. And what do they say about the ratio of power between China and Japan? And I did the math at the end, so I looked at how a posterior probability of each hypothesis is related to the others, and came up with a little bit of a different outcome with my posterior analysis. So the 2 strongest ones, which were kind of equally strong, were Japanese defensive capabilities and deterrence, and the US security guarantee. So how did I come to this conclusion, and why should we be interested in these sort of questions? Well, I would argue that the study of East Asia, at least in our Hungarian and European circles, usually is a bit lacking in IR and security related research. So it would be better to have more. Also, the defense policy of Japan is very much dominated by the questions of pacifism and the argument usually put forward by LDP circles of normalization, which are intriguing subjects. I'm not arguing that we shouldn't look at them, but I have the feeling, or I think, that sometimes this has the result of taking away a bit more attention from looking at, for example, the tangible objective security surroundings of Japan and how Japan reacts to it. So if we always treat Japan as a special country because of its constitution, that's true and that's warranted, but we will not be able to have deep comparative basis of analysis to look at, for example, how Japanese deterrence might be similar or dissimilar to, for example, how the Baltic states think about deterrence against Russia. So if we always narrow our focus on the pacifism and normalization, it will kind of also narrow down our capabilities to compare Japan to other actors. So I'm going to run out of time, so I'm going to jump over a couple of slides very quickly. But basically, as a context, I did outline the regional security complex of East Asia as put forward by the Copenhagen School of Security Studies, the Busan and Weaver, and argue that it's a region where we have multiple flashpoints that have within them the potential to escalate. And most of them are being conducted in gray zone, so other versions of hybrid confrontation. But we can have some sort of gradient and ranking between how much escalation potential these conflicts have. And I would argue that the Senkaku Islands dispute is not one of the lowest escalation potentials, but also probably has less escalation potential than Taiwan if we think about how much escalation this would mean quantitatively. So it does relate to Taiwan somewhat, but we should look at them in a different kind of framework. Yes. I also did an overview of Sino-Japanese relationships, which I'm not going to go in detail now, but basically we can give a larger arc where we have normalization of relations in the 1970s, we have increasing economic ties, we have lingering political and history memory issues come more and more to the front in the 1990s. And I think that a major turning point in the bilateral relation is the 2010s, where both countries increasingly start to look at each other. And if we look at Chinese security related documents, papers, national security strategies, defense white papers, we see wording that's kind of referent to Japan and Chinese sovereignty. And if we look at Japanese white papers, we also see the rise of this China threat. So I think that in the 2010s, we can identify a new phase where explicitly both sides have identified the other as some sort of a strategic conundrum. Maybe not threat, but a problem. And at the heart of this bilateral relationship and the rise of perception of the other as a security problem or issue is the Senkaku Islands themselves. So if you don't know what the Senkaku Islands are, basically they are a small uninhabited island grouping close to the shores of Taiwan and China's southern provinces, but it's part of Japan's Okinawa island group, Ryukyu Islands. Japan currently exercises sovereignty over the islands, but since the 1970s, both the People's Republic of China and the Republic of China, so Taiwan, have formulated official claims that they regard these islands as their own territory. For a while, neither Taiwan nor China did much to advance their claims. But I think I have it in the next one. In the 1990s, many different groups of activists will go to the islands, try to put up Taiwanese or Chinese flags, and the number of incidents will start to increase from the mid-1990s. We have a segment in the history of incidents related to the Senkaku Islands between 2000 and 2008, 2010, where we have a mix of participation in these kinds of actions from Taiwan and China. And increasingly from the 2010s, China will become the dominant actor in these sorts of gray zone activities. In 2013, we have, I think, the highest level of tension between China and Japan. So this is when we come closest to military escalation. This is the year that, according to the Japanese government, on multiple occasions, Chinese warships meeting Japanese GATI, so self-defense force units, both naval and air units, in international waters or airspace, have used their weapons targeting radar to lock on to these Japanese targets, which is the technical equivalent of me holding a weapon at someone's face and not pushing the trigger. But if it's true, it would be a problematic conduct. In 2021, the Chinese authorities and the Chinese political leadership has come out with a new law regulating the work of its Coast Guard and other maritime agencies. And this new law has authorized the Coast Guard to use lethal force when defending the sovereignty of Chinese territory. And this, at least according to Chinese interpretations, does apply to waters surrounding the Senkaku Islands. So far are somewhat important milestones, but mostly from a legal perspective. So the weapons targeting radar and the new Chinese law is also something that we should be looking at, but it's not actual military confrontation and military escalation yet. In both countries, we have civilian organizations or organizations somewhat related to the political fields that have put forward the issue of the Senkaku, or in China, the Diaoyu Islands, and present themselves as pressure groups towards both governments to kind of push them to have a more firm stance on the Senkaku Island issue. I think the most iconic in terms of Japan would be the Gambara Nippon and their actions, especially in the 1910s. And we should also mention Nippon Ishin no Kai, which was, it has a different name now, but it was a far-right political party within Japan, and they had a nationwide campaign to collect money to buy the remaining private-owned land on the Senkaku Islands. And it leads to a conundrum between China and Japan, because the Japanese government decides to buy these lands instead of Nippon Ishin no Kai. But we also have such civilian groupings and such activism in China. For example, one Chinese fashion model did a flash mob-like demonstration where she painted on herself Owutsurijima, the largest one of the Senkaku Islands, with writing protect and either Diaoyu, so one syllable from the Diaoyu, or our fishermen. You can kind of interpret it both ways. So there is a social pressure or a social push on both governments to have firm stances on the island issue. And if we look at statistics given out by the Japanese government, we also see an increase in Chinese activities near the islands. So they every year publish how many times Chinese ships have been close to the Senkaku Island shores, so within 12 nautical miles or 24 nautical miles. The blue one is the longer one, and the red one is the closer one. So this shows a gradual increase of Chinese presence. If we look at the strategic documents of both states, we also can highlight the process of the island issue and perceptions on the other country becoming more and more important, higher priority, and the maritime dimension of security highlighted more and more in their strategic communication. So, how does this relate to the defense policies of both countries? I'm going to be really brief on this because this is actually the main body of the dissertation. But I looked at the history of defense policy of China and Japan, and also compiled a larger database using the International Institute of Strategic Studies' military balance yearbooks. So in each year, how many main battle tanks of which type we can find in Japan, China, and do these show some kind of larger trends? And my argument was that, yes, we see some trend-like segments of the history of both countries' defense policies and defense capabilities. In China, in the 1980s, we see the start of defense reform. Basically, until the end of the 1980s, China was planning to build up its military capabilities, but there was no money. So money starts to appear at the end of the 1980s, but there's a problem. In 1989, the Chinese Communist Party uses the People's Liberation Army to quell down the protests at Tiananmen Square. So many different long-term defense capability enhancement plans had Western suppliers. And after Tiananmen Square, even until today, most countries in the world have an embargo on sending China defense-related equipment. Some might get around this, and then there's Russia, who doesn't have this embargo, but this creates a conundrum for China. We have money, but there's no one who's going to sell us high-end equipment, except for the Russians. So the 1980s and early 1990s are about China trying to figure out and rethink how it's going to build up its lacking military technological capabilities. And there's basically two avenues: buying stuff from the Russians and reverse engineering whatever you can. An important milestone in China's defense policy is the third Taiwan Strait crisis, because China realizes that it needs some sort of immediate deterrent, even when it's still not able to actually conduct an invasion against Taiwan. And also when the United States sends in the 7th Fleet demonstratively into the Taiwan Strait, the Chinese military leadership realizes that they don't really have any kind of assets to stop an American intervention. So from the mid-1990s, two trends will arise. China will exponentially increase the number of fielded ballistic missiles. In the case of short-range ballistic missiles, from less than a few hundreds to over 1,000, which is a huge increase. And these are the SRBMs, so ones that could basically just reach Taiwan. So this is against Taiwan. And in terms of the United States, China embarks on a buildup of capabilities that we usually refer to as anti-access area denial. Basically, A2AD means that I don't have the money and the capability to build a large fleet to meet another large fleet. So what I'm going to do is put a lot of anti-ship missiles on different platforms that can reach an oncoming fleet formation and hope to guarantee to them enough damage that they will not decide on an intervention. So that's A2AD. And from the 2010s, we see China being confident in its A2AD capabilities, start to build up its actual blue water naval capabilities, so fleet formations that can function in an offshore capacity. I have a couple of these statistics in graphs in English. I should have used a different one because this is until 2018. But these are PLA, so Chinese Navy main equipments. And we see two kinds of trends. We see the total number decrease for a while and increase after that. And this is actually China phasing out the equipment inherited by the Soviet Union in the 1960s and changing all these platforms to more and more capable high-end modern weaponry. So there is a quantitative decrease and increase and a constant qualitative increase within the capabilities of the PLA Navy. And that's how we arrive to a China that now has at least 2 functioning aircraft carriers. We can argue how functioning the Liaoning is, so the first one, but at least it's swimming, and a third one coming online quite quickly. China also now has amphibious assault ships, basically modeled after the US San Antonio class. Again, the reverse engineering seems to be paying off. And it also increasingly has ships that not only in size, but in capabilities can now match the ships of the United States and Japan. And I'm going to come a little bit more back to the Renhai class at the end of the lecture. If we look at Chinese air forces, we basically see the same trend. So phasing out Soviet equipment and replacing it with high-end equipment after the 2000s and mainly in the 2010s. And what happens with Japan? Basically, Japan also has to reshift its defense policy from the legacies of the Cold War. The main approach to Japanese defense strategy during the Cold War was to have its small number but very effective and high quality heavy equipment near Hokkaido, because what the Japanese were preparing for, together with the Americans, was a Soviet invasion coming from the north. With the end of the Soviet Union and the end of the bipolar world, this will fade away, mostly. And also at the end of the Cold War, Japan, during the Nakasone administration, had this promise to the United States that we're going to be a more active partner in the alliance. And what Japan was able to bring to the table was anti-submarine warfare capability. So a lot of Japanese warships at the end of the 1980s were equipped to hunt for Soviet submarines trying to get through the straits between Hokkaido and Honshu. There is a long segment of Japan rethinking what to do with defense policy as a whole, and the main drivers in this are the pressure from the United States to take more part in international peacekeeping operations. So actually most literature on Japanese defense policy built around the pacifism and normalization issues will focus on the legal process of how Japan will become able to send military units into international peacekeeping operations. I would argue that after the 2000s, there's another trend showing. Japan increasingly identifies the rise of Chinese capabilities as a problem, as a threat, and restructures its defense capabilities to be able to deal with a situation in the south coming from China. There are a couple of catchy named programs, such as Abe's Dynamic Joint Defense Force and some prior programs related to that. But the main gist of it is to refocus strike and heavy equipment capability from the north towards the south, and also build up naval and air capabilities to deal with the situation of a rising China. Since 2021, Japanese discourse on security has, I think, entered a new phase where Japanese leaders are now talking at least about what to do in case of a Taiwan contingency. So from the 2000s until 2020, Japan refocusing its attention on its own southern sector, and from 2021, linking this up with a Taiwan contingency. But at the heart of all of these are the Senkaku Islands. And if we look at Japanese changing defense capabilities, at least the statistics of it, it doesn't show much of a change. But the reason for this is that Japan, since the 1960s, 70s, was actually at the forefront of naval technology. So what Japan had to do was just keep on doing what it did before, to still have high-end qualitative naval capabilities. And Japan has the Atago and the Kongo class cruisers that basically almost match the United States Ehrlichberg destroyers, and this is where we would put China's some higher and destroyers and the Renhai class as well. So this is this is kind of the league that the big players are playing in terms of naval technology. Also, we see Japan building up capabilities for naval air assets. So I know that still we should not call aircraft carriers the Kaga and the Izumo strange things. Let's have it at that. They do look like an aircraft. We can call them flat tops, and then that's okay for everyone. And Japan also has very capable amphibious capabilities with the Osimi class amphibious assault ships. If we look at Japanese aircrafts, it's the fighter aircraft. It's the same as with naval capabilities. So Japan had relatively high quality capabilities to begin with after the Cold War, and it just kept up most of them and started to introduce new assets as they came along. So how does the defense policies of Japan and China relate to deterrence? Well, basically, first we should understand how should we conceptualize deterrence as a phenomenon. Basically, it relates to the problem of escalation. Escalation in this term means the increase of the intensity of a conflict, either qualitatively or quantitatively. It can increase quantitatively when you send more soldiers or work with more territory, and it can increase qualitatively when you start to use new kind of weapon systems. Deterrence is something that meant to stop exactly that. Deterrence is an approach where you want your enemy to think about what you can do to them and get your enemy to not conduct an action that's negative from your side. The problem with the literature and theoretic framework of deterrence and escalation is that both concepts were highly developed during the Cold War and are highly connected to nuclear deterrence and nuclear escalation. So most of the strategic theoretical works that you read will, in many cases, end up with issues regarding nuclear deterrence and nuclear escalation. There is much less look at the concepts of traditional, conventional deterrence. But basically, deterrence can have two ways. The two ways you can conduct deterrence is deterrence by punishment. So having strike capability where I'm not able to stop you from taking something of mine, but if you do, I'm going to use long-range strike capability to hit you where it hurts. And the other approach to deterrence is deterrence by denial. This might mean landmines, walls, or just conventional capabilities that are strong enough that if an opponent comes in, he is not able to calculate with a high level of success. And military planning is exactly supposed to do that. Calculate the ratios and probabilities of success and give over this option to political decision makers. And in best case scenarios, the political decision makers will make a rational choice. And if the probability of success is not high enough, then they will probably not conduct the action that the other side was trying to deter. My main argument is that we should understand Japanese defense policy as, at least until the 2020s, as something tailored towards deterrence by denial. And most of my hypotheses revolve around this idea of deterrence by denial. The reason I highlight that until the 2020s is because in the last couple of years, there have been some prominent researchers of Japanese security, mainly connected to GRIP's think tank, who have started to argue that this static defense, which basically deterrence by denial, might not be enough. And started to argue for Japan to have strike capability against distant targets, maybe even in mainland China. So it's possible that in the next decade, we are going to see a shift of Japanese reliance on deterrence by denial into the realm of deterrence by punishment, but that's something that's for the future for us to see. So we see defense capabilities. We know that there is an island dispute between the two countries. We know that there is a hybrid confrontation between them. But how can we make an educated guess on whether or not deterrence is working from Japan against China? Well, as I've said, military planning is about calculation and probabilities. So in order for us as well to understand the possible calculations, we should be able to somehow measure how the capabilities of these two countries relate to each other. And basically at the third part of my dissertation, I look at 4 different ways of measuring power. One is a very higher level abstract one, to look at GDP times GDP per capita, as put forward in MIT Security Studies Journal by Michael Beckley. A second one is looking at indexes that try to make composite military and national capabilities and rank countries alongside them. The next one is a comprehensive index of naval power and naval capability. And the final one is naval firepower as expressed by something called battle force missile. I think that these might be the ones that are much less familiar with an audience who's not in security studies. So I'm going to give a rough overview of what they are, but we can come back to the Q&A in the Q&A section to what are the specifics of them. Basically, using GDP times GDP per capita is warranted by Beckley's argument that the literature of international relations and international security most often uses GDP to express power in the largest scale on the international field. But Beckley looked at how many times was this actually able to forecast the end of a conflict. And he comes to the conclusion that GDP and another index, CINC, only have 50, maybe a little more percent predictive power, because they both only show how large you are, what weight category you're fighting in. They don't show your technique, your efficiency. So he argues that we should look at a combined value of GDP times GDP per capita. And that's what I did with Japan and China. So I looked at their GDP times GDP per capita, added it up, and looked at the ratio of those between China and Japan. And as you can see, there is a gradual shift towards Chinese advantage, but this is still close. The Opium Wars between China and Britain, which was the first case study for Beckley, had a GDP times GDP per capita difference of 20 to 80%. So that's the kind of ratio that you are looking for when you want overwhelming overpowering of your opponent. I looked at another couple of indexes. I can come back to it if you want in the Q&A. One is the CINC. Another one is a military power indexing technique done by the Lowy Institute. And the third one is, I think, the least methodologically sound one, but the most popular, the Global Firepower Index. And in all these kind of categories, China comes out on top in the 2020s. And depending on which one you look at, it comes out with an overwhelming majority sometimes. But this is because China is large, and most of these indexes use a lot of gross metrics as well. But when we think about the Senkaku Island, the main avenues for the conflict would be naval capabilities. So I looked at what kind of naval power methodology is most often cited in the literature and most often used, and it was an approach put forward by Mark Sova and Brian Benjamin, where they looked at the overall tonnage of navies, but disregarded those kinds of ships that you could not use in an offshore situation. There's a reason why in the age of missiles against ships, this is more importantly the case, that you should look at capital ships. So they express ships over, so submarines over 1,000 tons, frigates, destroyers, cruisers, carriers, and amphibious assault ships. I looked at Japan and China, and basically we see the same trend as with GDP times GDP per capita. Japan starts with a huge advantage, and it decreases, but still China is not at the magical 3-to-1 ratio, which most traditional military planning doctrine would say that you need a 3-to-1 ratio for a successive operation. Okay, and the last one I looked at was a methodology to measure naval firepower used by the American Navy and also by other researchers, called the battle force missile. Basically, battle force missile indicator shows you how many missiles simultaneously a ship or a configuration of ships can fire. And this basically gives you the firepower index of a naval grouping or a navy as a whole. We see the same trend as with GDP times GDP per capita. So Japan starts from up here, and basically what happens is China catches up with Japan by the 1920s and now has a higher ratio of battle force missiles, but still not nearly enough to have an operational confident advantage over Japan, especially if we look at the US forces in Japan, just the minimal skeletal number of ships that are always posted in Japan, and add this to the Japanese numbers, then we come closer to parity with China. So I looked at these factors and compiled a number of what I called new inferences and evidences and weighted them against each hypothesis. And my conclusion was, on the first try, my conclusion was that the Japanese deterrent was very high, but then I reevaluated with my thesis advisor some of the evidence. I looked at some of the inferences, and basically my final conclusion with the dissertation was that the most distinctive factors of deterrence are Japanese military capabilities and the United States security guarantee together. So why is this important? I think because this can give us a framework of understanding the differences between capabilities and how they relate to each other and what are the ratios. And we can use this to look at the Taiwan Strait situation. And it would be a little bit different. Taiwan is much weaker than Japan in terms of naval power projection, but just looking at firepower and missiles, it comes almost close to Japan, even more if you count anti-ship missiles launched from the shore, which means that the Japanese and Chinese ratio of forces are in a phase in the 2020s, so now, where China might be able to get the operational advantage in terms of firepower and other capabilities in the next couple of years. And if it does so with Japan, it's quite possible that it will also have it against Taiwan. But the other side of the coin is that both Taiwan and both Japan are looking at these changing capabilities, and the United States is also looking at these changing capabilities. So we cannot know for sure if they are also not going to catch up with the increase in Chinese capabilities. And I think I'm going to stop now to have time for Q&A. Yes, just a final thought. This is not part of the dissertation, but for as a thought process and analysis, I looked at some of the same metrics between China and Taiwan, and my argument was concludent with most of Western analysis that China is still not at the stage to go for Taiwan with a full-scale invasion. But I think that it has a high level of operational confidence to look at outlier islands of Taiwan. And I think the most important of these would be the Penghu Islands. They are close to mainland Taiwan, or the main Taiwanese islands. And whenever there is a limited conflict, you have to ask yourself, is outside help coming to Taiwan if it's just about a swath of small islands next to the main island? So China can calculate with a lesser percentage or lesser probability of outside help coming. And if China has the Senkaku Islands, that's, operationally speaking, that's a game changer. That limits the length of the sea that you have to traverse with an invasion contingency to 40 kilometers from 200. So I think that the main indicator, or in the next couple of years, we should look at the changing capabilities and how these relate to each other. And I think that we should look at possibilities and look at Chinese comments, specifically targeting the Senkaku Islands. So what does China think about this? Can the Senkaku Islands become the next Crimean Peninsula, but in East Asia? Okay, so I'm going to stop there. Sorry, to have some time to Q&A.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Andres. Brilliant. So I'm going to open up first now. Hopefully everyone can still hear me on the mic, but I'm going to open up first to our audience here, and then I will switch over as we have a large number of.
Might be better.
So I think you might not pick me up. So we've got a little bit of an echo on this. Okay, hopefully everybody is still picking me up okay on the microphone. Sorry for the switching and changing. So just to say that we're first going to open up for Q&A here live in the room, and then we will move over to our Q&A questions that we've already received from the chat from our larger online audience. So first of all, over to you guys. Questions, queries, thoughts. Jason.
Thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. A lot of new things for me because I am a historian. I work mostly on 20th century. And my question relates to that. So you were very well aware of several naval treaties that were limiting or delineating the sizes of different navies. The first one, the biggest, most important one, the Washington Conference, 1921 and 22, in which the Japanese Navy was limited at 60% of British and American Navy, technically making it the world's third largest navy, ahead of nations like Italy, Germany, etc. Then, of course, you have the 1930 London Treaty, at which there were a lot of debates, and still, the powers refused to allow Japan to build more ships. Does that kind of treaty or measurement or some kind of limitation still apply? And if yes, how do the Chinese and Japanese navies then measure in terms of capabilities? Obviously, I know it's a complex thing. It's for a certain type of ships. I know that there can be a certain percentage, but are there any kind of naval limitation treaties to which both China and Japan are party? And if that's the case, then are they like, which one is more favorable, etc.? So that's the question.
To the best of my knowledge, no. And I think the answer has to do with the way naval warfare changed since 1930s. So both the Washington and the London, these treaties limited not just the number of ships, but limited tonnage, so size. And this actually had a highly effective operational limitation on navies at the time, because the main strike capability were cannons. So over a certain size, a ship can carry such armor and such cannons that only ships of equal size will be able to realistically sink them. Already with, sorry, swallowed that piece of dust. So with the advent of aircraft, naval aircraft and carriers, we see the end of these kinds of major capital ships, because you don't need another battle cruiser to drop a bomb on, for example, the Yamato, then it sinks. Now, naval warfare is conducted with missiles, and even the largest naval ships can only take maybe 2 or 3 anti-ship cruise missiles and still be operational. In best options, maybe 4. And ships fire missiles at least over the destroyer, and at the cruiser level, they fire missiles in 40s, 60s, 100. So actually, a better limitation would be the number of missiles that you can have, but you can put missiles on small boats as well. So in navies today, compared to pre-World War II era navies, we have such a distributed level and distributed nature of firepower, and such low survivability compared to that, so that the same kind of logics that these naval treaty limitations were working with would not really have much of an applicance for today's navies. And you also have to factor in air power. So a lot of threats coming to navies would come from the air, from maybe carrier or shore-launched fighters bringing with them anti-ship cruise missiles. So it's much more complex operational-wise today than it was in the 1920s and 30s, and just limiting the number of ships or tonnage, still tonnage and number of ships count, but not in the same quality as it did in the 1920s and 30s.
And the second question, how do the Japanese and Chinese navies then compare? You talked about measuring power. How do their power can be measured? And if you do measure that, which one is on top? Right?
China is the largest. China has the largest number of ships. But if we look at how large these ships are, so there are categories or classifications of ships. The smallest one that's a warship and not just a patrol boat is a corvette. And then you have frigates, and then destroyers and cruisers. The bigger they get, the higher the category. And with missiles, you need to have air defense to be able to defend yourself against missiles. And a small ship can only have strike capability, but will not have a high enough superstructure to get a long enough coverage of its radars and its sensors to be able to react to a missile coming to it. So below the level of frigate, and actually rather below the level of destroyer, you need another large ship helping you to form this air defense shield over you. And in terms of destroyers, until 2 years ago, Japan actually, with its limitations of 1% GDP, had more destroyers than China. Still, in 2022, Japan has actually more cruiser-level ships than China. So when it comes to capital ships, Japan had an advantage until now. China, we can see the tempo of Chinese shipbuilding. So China is going to take over this place from Japan. But until at least the 2020s, Japan was ahead of China in terms of what we call blue water. So those ships that can go far ashore, have their own air defense, can form an air defense umbrella over a formation. And also Chinese ships were, so I looked at BFM numbers, battle force missile numbers. Basically, you have to look at how many ships there are from a certain type and how many missiles can a certain type of ship fire. For a long time, Chinese were not able to pack large numbers of missiles onto modern warships. So there's also a disadvantage for China to overcome. And that's why, for example, the Renhai class is important, because it can now match the same sort of weight category of the Erlenberg destroyers or the Atago class in Japan. So that, yeah, Japan had a quantitative advantage in higher end or blue water ships for a long time, or almost until now, and it still kind of has a quantitative edge, and now it still kind of has a qualitative edge, but it's diminishing.
Thank you for a very detailed answer.
Thank you very much. Okay, so other questions. We have a nice balance of undergraduate and postgraduate here in the room, so I'd very much like to hear from our students. Conrad, go ahead.
Yeah, So, with regards to the Senkaku Islands, does Japan fully acknowledge it as part of its land? So, any sort of incursion would count as.
Yes.
It does.
It does. And defense doctrines state that Japan is preparing to either stop someone from invading them or retake the islands if someone took them. And also Japan has had the United States Congress state that the Senkaku Islands are covered under the security treaty between the US and Japan in 2012. And since 2014, American presidents have stated that the United States would be obliged to come to Japan's aid if the Senkaku Islands were attacked. So yes, very much regarding it as Japanese territory technically. We can argue if the Diaoyu claim is legally valid or not. I'm not an international legal scholar, so I don't know. But technically, de facto, Japan has the islands and is preparing to defend the islands if it comes to a conflict.
And so relating to your analysis of the different naval powers, or in general military powers, so in the very first one, I'm pretty sure the discrepancy was 48% compared for Japan compared to 52 for China, and that's unaccounting for any sort of US Navy power that's already.
That's unaccounting for, yes.
That's accounting already.
That's unaccounting for US power. That's the tricky part, because technically that usually it would be a.
Maybe scroll back to that slide.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Somewhere here. So usually, this is the conundrum. Usually, it should be a political decision. If you are stationed in another nation as an ally, and something happens, the actual process of decision to act or not should be a political process. But looking at the Japanese and American defense cooperation guidelines, looking at how within the command structure, how the US forces in Japan are incorporated into the Japanese command structure, we don't know for sure because we don't have precedent, but we can have a high confidence in probability that US forces in Japan would automatically be engaged if something happened to the Senkaku Islands, unless the US president specifically says not to. So if no contrary command comes on a proactive basis, US forces in Japan would highly probably be involved in, for example, the Senkaku Island issue.
Thank you. Any other questions from our audience here?
Just one small.
Okay,
because on your slide about what China has, what kind of aircraft China has, I noticed there was one like a Su-27/J-11 one, and that was the only time where, not all the time. There's another Su-33 Shenyang J-15. So does this mean that these are reverse engineered or maybe reworked Sus for China, and they're just named as Chinese
yes, China has kept some of the Su models it got from the Russians, and they are intact, and took some of them, took them apart, and came up with its own versions, and the J-11 is one of those. And this was actually a matter of diplomatic and political friction between.
So it was reverse engineered.
It was reverse engineered, and the Russians were kind of mad about it. At the end of the 1990s, early 2000s. And actually, that's why China had to take its own course to develop, for example, the J-10, the air superiority fighter, and develop the 5th generation fighter, so the Chengdu J-20 and the upcoming J-36 or J-31, which are just copies of the US F-22 and F-35. Russia was not going to go and jointly develop the Su-57 because the Chinese have already reverse engineered one fighter. So it was a matter of actual political and diplomatic friction at the end of the 1990s that the Russian defense military industrial complex was not overly happy about seeing the Chinese versions of the Su-77. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, well, if we don't have, there's lots of questions that I would like to answer, or sorry, ask, but I won't abuse my position as chair to do that yet. So we'll switch over to the online questions now from our audience. So Liam Head asks, this question is a bit more general, but do you ever think Japan's constitution will ever be adjusted, in brackets, so they can actually hold a military outside of the JSDN in the near future, in response to the growing tension in East Asia? And then how explicitly would China have to act to cause this change in the constitution if it were to happen? Long
That's
question.
a complicated question.
Repeat certain parts. I think the core of it is basically.
I think I understand the
Yeah,
gist of it.
sure.
Yes. So the problem with the G8I right now, the Japanese self-defense forces, is that half of Japanese legal scholars think that this is no longer constitutionally valid, because Japan is not supposed to have a military with Article 9 of the Constitution. So to the best of my knowledge, the LDP proposal to change the Constitution was not to disregard Article 9, but rewrite one sentence that says Japan doesn't have land, air, sea forces, and just write G8I. I'm not a constitutional legal scholar, but I guess if you just rewrite that sentence, you open up the box to reinterpret a bunch of defense policy laws, and then you can do whatever you want. But actually, in reality, Japan has its pacifist constitution, but whenever it needs certain, or feels that it needs certain capabilities, it goes around the wording of the constitution. So Japan is not supposed to have aircraft carriers, ballistic missiles, and strategic bombers. We have the Izumo class, the flat top, which kind of looks like an aircraft carrier. And, you know, the Japanese government said this is never going to be an aircraft carrier because we don't have F-36Bs. And then they brought F-36Bs. And then China and South Korea was obviously a bit anxious and asked, okay, what's happening here? And they said, it's okay that the surface is not covered in insulative material, so it would burn with the exhaust of the F-36B. And then it comes out of refurbishing in 2018, and oh, accidentally we have covered it with insulation. And now Japan had a couple of exercises where American F-35Bs landed on the Izumo. So they're obviously building aircraft carriers. So they have actually changed the defense law that said Japan cannot have aircraft carriers, and now it says Japan cannot have kogekigata, so offensive aircraft carriers. Japan cannot have ballistic missiles, but is working on a hypersonic missile program of its own. It's not a ballistic missile, but it can basically do the same thing, but it has a different name. Strategic bomber, F-35. Japan is developing long strike capability together with Great Britain and I think Norway. And it's not going to look like a strategic bomber, but it's going to do the same thing. So I think that even with the constitution, even with pacifist limitations, Japan can find loopholes to create military capability, or we see precedent Japan finding loopholes to create the kind of military capabilities that are needed to deal, at least according from the Japanese perspective, to deal with the changing security architecture of South and East Asia.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much. Hopefully that very comprehensively answers your question, Liam. Okay, we also have a question from Frusina. I hope I've pronounced that right, but I probably haven't. Vadaj, who asks, Andras, thanks for this great presentation. One of my research areas is hibakusha, remembrance culture. This week we had a mourning day due to the death anniversary of Sasaki Sadako, RIP, October 25th, 1955. This is a great peace movement in Japan against war itself. Origami cranes and so on. How is the public opinion about changing the constitution and about building up the defense capability equipment? So in other words, how is the public opinion in Japan? I think that.
Yes, that's a tricky question, because if you look at different opinion polls, you would usually see that there's not an overwhelming majority of Japanese supporting a constitutional change. But if you put the question like this, do you like the G8I? And do you want the GATI to have increased capabilities? You actually have an increasing public opinion that we kind of feel threatened by China and North Korea. So we don't want the constitution to change, but increasing number of answers will be that yes, the GATI should have the current or increasing capabilities. And I think it's around 80% sometimes, although these are government funded surveys. So, you know, you can tinker with surveys if you want, but I think they do reflect that changing the constitution, probably not so much. Building up defense capabilities, yes. The Japanese public seems to be on board with that.
Excellent, thank you. So hopefully that gives you the subtle answer to that quite difficult question. Okay, we have one more question from Liam, and then maybe I'll wrap up with the final question. So Liam also asks, how does North Korea play into this entire situation at all for either China or Japan or US policy, considering they've recently been testing cruise missiles in the last decades pretty haphazardly?
Yes, I think that's one of the most interesting questions. North Korea, with its ballistic missile program, has affected Japanese defense policy decision-making for Japan to enter into a highly advanced ballistic missile defense program with the United States. That's the Aegis missile defense system. And the Aegis ballistic missile defense system is based on targeting and sensory systems of cruisers and destroyers. So Japan was able to sell to the Japanese public, building the Kongo, the Atago, and now the Maya classes as something against North Korea. But guess what? The same kind of radars that look for ballistic missiles coming from North Korea are also very useful to look for cruise missiles coming from China. And actually, an Aegis missile destroyer is the highest end of naval technology. So North Korea gave at the end of the 1990s and early 2000s, actually gave Japanese political decision makers the excellent package to bring in high-end naval capability under the pretext of ballistic missile defense, and now they have it for dual use. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I know one or two people that have written books on that, in fact. Okay, so we don't have any other questions as yet in the Q&A from our online audience, although we have lots of participants. So please do all chip in with your questions and queries. I know that people are being very polite or shy, perhaps, but we still have a little bit of time left for a couple more questions. So I might just ask, maybe instead of all of these questions about how the world is going to come to an end, I might ask you a question that's a little bit more positive in terms of how we might de-escalate, right, some of these issues. So the assumption from your research, and you're not alone in this, right, but the assumption seems to be that there will be this escalation, and that as Chinese capabilities increase, this is very concerning, which it is. But as somebody that focuses mostly on Okinawa, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how potentially positive change in terms of a reduction in, for example, US forces from Okinawa to the so-called second island chain, in combination with kind of commercial and economic activities that go on those islands, how those kind of activities might increase opportunities for cooperation and decrease opportunities or decrease the danger of escalation. Sorry, a lot of stuff there, but if you'd like to speculate.
The reason I paused for a moment is because to me, when I look at these numbers and when I try to look at this research, it kind of convinces me that deterrence has actually worked. So I know that I actually don't like the narrative that we're going to have a large-scale war, because I think that we have never had a time in history where major military powers had so much open information about each other's capabilities. We have thousands of people as academic and think tank apparatus analyzing this, and the Chinese are also looking at the same numbers. I think that the level of transparency with capabilities has a very positive effect. And I haven't highlighted it here, but there has been research conducted on whether or not China is a rational actor. And most have focused on the South China Sea. But the overwhelming conclusion is that the style of the Chinese political leadership is actually highly rational to begin with. So I think that, yes, balances are shifting, but also other countries are building up capabilities, and everyone is aware of what everyone else has. So this is very different than, for example, if you look at reports from Japan and the US about what exactly the other side has before the Second World War. So we know a lot. And I think that we can look at mechanisms that give precedent, that deterrence can work, and this transparency in these mechanisms can actually be something that might be a decisive factor in not de-escalation, because I don't think this is going to de-escalate, but keeping it from escalating.
Excellent, thank you. That's very encouraging indeed, and completely answering. So transparency, yeah, a fascinating topic in itself. Brilliant. All right. Do we have any final? Yeah, another question from Colin. Go ahead.
Yeah. So you mentioned how we can all kind of observe each other's military power, which is obviously the case. But with the recent kind of consolidation of power with Xi Jinping, I kind of fear a situation where he's going to end up hearing things that he rather wants to hear, rather than opposing or contradictions to his beliefs, right? So the information which he's receiving isn't entirely accurate because of fear of repercussions within his party. I mean, do we see that as a potential factor for causing a miscalculation, for example, of Taiwan or the Senkaku Islands, because they may evaluate that actually we should do an intervention, but rather the information being fed to Xi is that, you know, we've got greater military power than they actually do because they want to, you know, satisfy them.
Yeah, I get what you're saying, and it's a black box, so we don't see what's happening there. But I'm not sure. I haven't done deep research on the personality of Xi Jinping, but he's very different than Vladimir Putin. Putin comes from KGB. He comes from political coercive background, and the culture of the Chinese Communist Party is actually kind of building up through technocratic, step-by-step, not meritocratic, but at least being knowledgeable in the subject. And I think I would give you two things to kind of ease your mind. Xi Jinping, one of the first positions that he had as a junior, higher level party commissariat was stationed at the Central Military Staff as a political officer during the Vietnamese-Chinese War. And the main job that he had to do was to damage control a basically stalemated or lost war. So he has a formative experience of what it means to roll the dice, and you don't have overwhelming power, and then you don't come up on top at the end. He was also, I think, a party officer of the Fujian province during the Taiwan Strait crisis. He also went through looking at narratives, looking at public opinion in a time when China was actually humiliated, with the US sending in the 7th Fleet. So he has two very formative experiences from his youth that I think, even if he hears the things he wants to hear, his psyche was probably formed to be cautious at the age of like 40, 50. So I think those were probably formative in a way that even with his current tenure had their imprint on Xi Jinping's mindset. I'm not sure. I don't know, but that's just my educated guess.
I think that's fair enough. The main reason I kind of that stood out to me was because I'd say that recent decisions of, for example, still continuing with the zero tolerance of the COVID policy. I mean, I think that's some grand miscalculation. I think most advisors would tell it that it's not a sound policy to instate.
Yeah, but we don't know what other options he had. I mean, I'm not saying it was a good policy. It's just that we don't know what was weighed against what, that he came up with this conclusion. So I do get this question a lot from students and in panel discussions. I don't think we should put an equation between the mindset of Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. We don't have precedent and prior examples of the Chinese leadership through generations being as harsh and as irrational as Putin seems. And I think he's not irrational. I do think there's a reason for his presenting of his actions and even presenting his sickness. We can go into that maybe after the lecture. But we don't see the Chinese Communist Party's top leadership give precedence for us to think that they would become irrational actors. They might. I'm not saying they never would, but so far the evidence has not pointed that way.
Excellent, thank you. And on that very positive note, I think we will probably wrap up there and thank our speaker once again in the normal way. So thank you very much to everyone. It just leaves me to hand over now to our the Director of Center for Japanese Studies, Mr. Sherzog Murinov, to give you some information about upcoming events.
I think I should probably stand here just so you can hear me better. And we have, let me one moment, I will have the poster open. So our next event in this autumn webinar seminar research series for the Center for Japanese Studies will be on the 10th of November, so in 2 weeks' time. It will be at a slightly different time from the ones that we've had. So this one and the one before we've had at 1 p.m. UK time. This upcoming one only will be at 6 p.m. GMT for the sole reason that the participants who are joining online are all based in North America. So 1 p.m. would be a bit too early because some of them are all actually in the west coast of North America. So the event itself is called Roundtable Discussion on the Imagination and the Real. And the participants are Professors William Marotti from UCLA, Kelly McCormick from UBC, University of British Columbia, and Emmy F. Bushell from Western Washington University. So they're all actually from the west coast of North America. So we hope to see many of you online at that event. And there are also 2 more events after that coming, but we will be announcing them in due course. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. And thank you very much, Andras, for your wonderful presentation.